She texted during my father's funeral, "This is pointless. I'm meeting Jake for cocktails." I never imagined that the woman I'd planned to spend my life with would abandon me during the darkest moment I'd ever faced. The signs had been there for months, but grief has a way of clouding judgment, and I'd been too focused on planning a wedding to notice my fiancée was already planning her exit. I'm Ben, 34, an electrical engineer who learned everything about life, work, and integrity from my father Walter. Dad raised me alone after my mother walked out when I was 10, and he became both parents rolled into one incredible man. He worked as a master electrician for 40 years, his calloused hands building everything from factory power systems to the custom electrical work in our modest two-bedroom house. Walter never missed a school event, worked double shifts to fund my engineering degree, and taught me that a man's word and his craftsmanship were the only things that truly mattered in this world. We weren't wealthy, but we were rich in the ways that actually count. Every Saturday morning, I'd find him in his woodshop behind the house, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and the sound of careful precision. He'd built that shop himself, installing every outlet and light fixture with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything else in his life. It was his sanctuary, where he created furniture for neighbors, repaired broken items for anyone who asked, and taught me to use tools properly and safely. Walter had this philosophy that you could tell everything about a person by watching them work with their hands. Patient people took time to measure twice and cut once. Honest people didn't cut corners even when no one was watching. Generous people shared their knowledge freely with anyone willing to learn. 3 months before my planned wedding to Monica, Walter suffered a massive stroke while working on a jewelry box in his shop. The paramedics found him collapsed beside his workbench, still clutching the sandpaper he'd been using to smooth the delicate inlay work. He was 61 years old, strong as an oak tree, and gone before I could even reach the hospital. The shock of losing him so suddenly felt like having my foundation ripped away without warning. In those first raw days after his death, I wandered through his workshop like a ghost, discovering half-finished projects everywhere. A dining table for Mrs. Peterson next door. A toy chest for his co-worker's grandson. And there, carefully wrapped in an old sheet, was the jewelry box he'd been crafting for Monica. The wood was beautiful cherry, with intricate dovetail joints that spoke to decades of practiced skill. The top was inlaid with a delicate pattern of maple and walnut, and inside he'd installed tiny LED lights that illuminated compartments lined with burgundy velvet. A handwritten note tucked inside read, "For Monica, may your marriage be built with the same care and patience as this box. Welcome to our family. Love, Walter." I sat in that workshop for hours, holding that note and trying to process the magnitude of what I'd lost. Walter hadn't just been my father, he'd been my mentor, my moral compass, and my best friend. He'd been planning to walk me down the aisle, give the father of the groom speech he'd been quietly preparing for months, and officially welcome Monica into our small but tight-knit family. Now I had to face the wedding planning, the grief, and the future without his steady presence guiding me through it all. The jewelry box became a symbol of everything Walter had hoped for my future, a tangible reminder of his love and his expectations for the life I was building. Looking at it, I realized I'd been so focused on creating the perfect wedding that I'd stopped paying attention to whether I was building it with the right person. I'd met Monica 2 years earlier at a tech conference in San Francisco where she was coordinating corporate events for major companies. She was everything I wasn't: polished, sophisticated, connected to a world of wealth and influence that felt completely foreign to my blue-collar upbringing. Monica came from serious money. Her father owned a chain of luxury hotels across California, and she'd grown up attending private schools and summer homes in Napa Valley. When she first showed interest in me, a humble electrical engineer from Sacramento who drove a 10-year-old Ford pickup, I felt like I'd won some kind of cosmic lottery. She was beautiful in that effortless way that comes from good genetics and expensive maintenance, always perfectly dressed and able to navigate social situations with the kind of confidence I'd never possessed. Our courtship felt like something out of a movie, fancy restaurants I'd never heard of, weekend trips to Monterey, cultural events where I learned to appreciate wine and art. Monica seemed genuinely charmed by what she called my authentic lifestyle, claiming she was tired of pretentious men who only cared about status and appearances. She said I was refreshingly real, grounded in a way that made her feel safe and valued. Walter had been cautiously supportive but privately expressed concerns about whether we were truly compatible long-term. He never said anything directly critical, but I caught him watching Monica during family dinners with that analytical expression he got when troubleshooting complex electrical problems. 8 months ago, everything began to shift when Monica's college roommate Jake moved to Sacramento to open his high-end restaurant in the trendy downtown district. Jake was everything I wasn't: tall, charismatic, wealthy, and connected to the same social circles Monica had grown up in. He drove a BMW, wore expensive suits, and spoke the language of fine dining and craft cocktails that Monica found intoxicating. Within weeks of his arrival, Monica's behavior changed dramatically. She started staying out late for what she called networking events at Jake's restaurant, claiming she was helping him build connections with corporate clients for private events. Her criticism of our modest lifestyle became more frequent and pointed. Our Saturday morning routine of coffee and farmers market visits was suddenly boring and predictable. Our cozy duplex that we'd been saving to buy was now cramped and embarrassing when she wanted to host her new friends. She began dropping hints about how successful Jake was becoming, how his restaurant was already booked solid with wealthy clientele, how he really understood the importance of image and presentation in business. I started noticing little changes: new jewelry she claimed was costume but looked expensive, designer clothes that cost more than my monthly truck payment, a sudden obsession with her appearance that included weekly salon visits and a personal trainer. When I asked about the expenses, she grew defensive and irritable, claiming she needed to maintain a certain image for her career advancement. The woman who had once praised my authenticity was now embarrassed by the very qualities that had attracted her initially. Walter noticed the tension during our last dinner together, just 2 weeks before his stroke. Monica spent the entire meal discussing Jake's restaurant success and her expensive taste in wine while Walter listened politely but grew visibly uncomfortable. She took 3 phone calls during dinner, each one with Jake about restaurant business that apparently couldn't wait. When she stepped outside for a 4th call that lasted 20 minutes, Walter looked at me with that serious expression he reserved for important conversations. "Son," he said quietly, "I've seen this pattern before. Some people check out of relationships mentally long before they leave physically. Your mother did the same thing, started finding fault with everything, became distant and critical, always had somewhere else she'd rather be." His words stung because I'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. That dinner turned out to be one of the last meaningful conversations I'd ever have with Walter, and his words would haunt me in the weeks that followed. Monica's disrespect toward my family had been growing more obvious, but that evening it reached a new level that made even my patient father visibly uncomfortable. She arrived 30 minutes late without apology, immediately launching into complaints about having to drive to our suburban wasteland instead of meeting at one of the trendy downtown restaurants she preferred. Throughout dinner, she dominated the conversation with stories about Jake's restaurant, the wealthy clientele he was attracting, and the sophisticated lifestyle she was being exposed to through their business partnership. Walter tried multiple times to steer the conversation toward family topics, asking about our wedding plans, sharing stories about his work, inquiring about Monica's own family, but she responded with minimal interest and quickly redirected back to Jake and his success. When Walter mentioned a project he was finishing for a veteran's widow, Monica actually rolled her eyes and muttered something about charity work under her breath. The phone calls during dinner were the final straw. Each interruption became longer and more intimate, with Monica stepping onto the porch where we could see her laughing and gesturing animatedly through the window. When she returned from the 4th call, flushed and energized in a way I hadn't seen from her in months, Walter excused himself to check on dessert. He pulled me into the kitchen with that serious expression I'd learned to recognize from childhood. "Ben, I need to tell you something and I want you to really hear me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of painful experience. "People show you who they really are when life gets difficult. Your mother started acting exactly like this before she left, always somewhere else she'd rather be, always finding fault with our life together, always making me feel like I wasn't enough." He paused, looking through the doorway where Monica was back on her phone, completely ignoring our family dinner. I stayed quiet too long, hoping things would improve, telling myself she was just going through a phase. But checking out of a relationship isn't a phase, it's a choice. And when someone makes that choice, no amount of love or patience from your side can change their mind. His words hit me like a physical blow because they articulated fears I'd been suppressing for months. I wanted to defend Monica, to explain that she was just stressed about work, that the wedding planning was overwhelming her, that she'd come around once things settled down. But watching her through the doorway, animated and happy while talking to Jake but distant and irritable with my father and me, I couldn't deny what was right in front of me. Dad, what am I supposed to do? We're getting married in 3 months. Everything's already planned and paid for. Walter put his hand on my shoulder with that gentle strength that had guided me through every major decision in my life. Son, it's better to call off a wedding than to divorce a wife. Marriage should be built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. If she can't show basic courtesy to your family during good times, what do you think will happen when real challenges come along? Those proved to be some of his final words about relationships, wisdom born from his own painful experience with my mother's abandonment. I initially dismissed his concerns as old-fashioned protectiveness, convincing myself that Monica just needed time to adjust to our different backgrounds and lifestyles. But his warnings about recognizing when someone has mentally checked out would echo in my mind with devastating clarity in the days to come. Walter's funeral was held at the local VFW hall where he'd volunteered for 15 years, helping veterans navigate disability claims and organizing monthly dinners for those struggling with isolation and financial hardship. I'd spent 3 days planning every detail to honor his service and community involvement, from arranging his military honors ceremony to coordinating with his Army buddies who wanted to serve as pallbearers. The hall was packed with people whose lives Walter had touched, co-workers from the electrical union, neighbors whose homes he'd wired, veterans he'd helped through bureaucratic nightmares, and families whose kids he'd taught basic electrical safety at community workshops. Monica sat beside me in the front row, but she might as well have been on another planet. From the moment we arrived, her phone was out, fingers constantly moving across the screen with urgent intensity. During the opening prayer, she was texting. During the first eulogy from Walter's foreman, who shared stories about his mentorship of young electricians, she was scrolling social media. When his Army sergeant spoke about Walter's service in Korea and his dedication to fellow veterans, Monica was taking selfies and posting them to her Instagram story with captions about difficult days and being there for family. The disrespect was so blatant that people around us began noticing and whispering. Mrs. Peterson, our elderly neighbor who Walter had helped for years, kept glancing at Monica with obvious disapproval. Walter's co-workers, rough men who respected silence and dignity during solemn occasions, were visibly disturbed by her behavior. I felt humiliated and angry, but trapped by the setting and my grief, unable to confront her without causing a scene at my father's funeral. The breaking point came during my own eulogy, when I was sharing stories about Walter's integrity and the lessons he'd taught me about commitment and family loyalty. My voice cracked as I spoke about how he'd been both father and mother to me, how he'd sacrificed his own comfort to ensure I had opportunities he'd never had, how his workshop was filled with projects intended to bring joy to others' lives. In that moment of raw vulnerability, standing before a room full of people who'd loved and respected my father, my phone buzzed with a text from Monica. I glanced at it instinctively and felt my world collapse. "This is pointless," it read. "I'm meeting Jake for cocktails at that new rooftop place downtown. Don't wait up for me tonight. This whole thing is just too depressing and I need to be around positive energy right now." I stared at the message for several seconds, my eulogy forgotten, trying to process the magnitude of what I was reading. My wife-to-be had just abandoned me during my father's funeral to meet another man for drinks, calling the ceremony honoring my father's life pointless and too depressing. The cruelty was so breathtaking that I almost couldn't believe it was real. I looked up from my phone to see Monica quietly gathering her purse and jacket, preparing to leave. She caught my eye and shrugged apologetically, mouthing sorry, while pointing to her phone as if she'd received some urgent emergency call. But I'd seen the text she'd sent me. I knew exactly where she was going and why. As I struggled to continue my eulogy, fighting back tears of grief and rage, Monica slipped out during the closing prayer. The sight of her walking away while I stood at the podium sharing my father's final wisdom about loyalty and commitment was burned into my memory forever. I finished the service alone, shaking hands with Walter's friends and family while trying to explain Monica's absence with vague references to a work emergency. But several people had witnessed her obvious disrespect throughout the ceremony, and their sympathetic looks told me they understood exactly what kind of woman I'd chosen to marry. The contrast between Walter's community of loyal, dependable people and Monica's selfish abandonment couldn't have been clearer. After the reception ended and I'd thanked the last of Walter's friends for coming, I drove home in complete silence, my mind oscillating between grief and rage. The house felt hollow without Walter's presence, but it also felt contaminated by Monica's betrayal. I stood in our bedroom for a long moment, staring at the wedding dress hanging in the closet, the marriage license we'd picked up the week before Walter's death, the stack of wedding invitations ready to be mailed. Then I walked to Monica's side of the dresser and began methodically packing her belongings. As I worked, I discovered evidence of her affair hidden throughout our home like archaeological layers of deception. Hotel receipts from expensive downtown establishments tucked between her jewelry and makeup. A second phone charger that didn't match any device I knew she owned. Designer earrings and a bracelet I'd never seen before, far too expensive for her salary or anything I would have purchased. A small tablet hidden behind her shoeboxes, password protected but automatically logged into social media accounts that revealed months of intimate conversations and photos with Jake. The pictures were devastating. Romantic dinners I'd never been invited to, weekend trips she'd claimed were work conferences, intimate moments that made clear their relationship had progressed far beyond friendship or business partnership. Reading through their messages was like watching my entire relationship dissolve in real time. Monica complained constantly about my boring lifestyle, my limited ambitions, my embarrassing blue-collar background. She described feeling trapped in our engagement, counting down days until she could figure out how to escape without looking like the villain. Jake encouraged her to prioritize her own happiness, suggesting I was holding her back from the sophisticated lifestyle she deserved. Their plans for tonight's rooftop cocktails were just the latest in a series of increasingly bold dates, as if they were testing how much disrespect I would tolerate before finally taking action. I contacted a 24-hour locksmith and had every lock in the house changed by 8 p.m. Then I called the divorce attorney whose card Walter's friend had given me months earlier, when he'd sensed trouble in my relationship and wanted me to have options. Mark Davidson specialized in cases involving adultery and asset protection, and fortunately was available for emergency consultations. We spent 2 hours on the phone while I forwarded him screenshots of Monica's conversations with Jake, photos of the hotel receipts, and a detailed timeline of her increasingly suspicious behavior. The funeral incident alone constitutes abandonment, Mark explained. Combined with clear evidence of adultery and financial deception, you have an airtight case for divorce with cause. She won't be entitled to alimony, and you can protect your assets and your father's estate from any claims she might make. I immediately transferred our joint savings account into my individual name and canceled all credit cards where Monica was an authorized user. Mark advised me to document everything: the funeral abandonment, the affair evidence, the financial irregularities, and prepare divorce papers citing adultery, abandonment, and irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. By midnight, I had a comprehensive legal strategy in place and Monica's belongings neatly packed in boxes stacked in the garage. The wedding dress went into a box too, along with all the planning materials and deposits we'd never recover. I felt strangely calm as I worked, like Walter's spirit was guiding me through the practical steps necessary to protect myself from further damage. This was exactly the kind of methodical problem-solving he'd taught me throughout my life. Identify the issue, gather the facts, develop a solution, execute the plan with precision. Monica had made her choice when she abandoned me at my father's funeral. Now I was making mine. At 4:17 a.m., I heard the sound of expensive heels clicking up our front walkway, followed by the mechanical whir of a car engine idling in the driveway. Monica's drunken laughter carried through the night air, mixed with a deeper male voice I recognized as Jake's. I watched through the bedroom window as she stumbled toward the front door, clearly intoxicated from hours of cocktails and celebration while I'd been grieving my father and dismantling our life together. She fumbled with her keys for several minutes, growing increasingly frustrated and confused as they failed to work in the newly changed locks. "What the hell?" she muttered loudly enough for me to hear through the door. "Ben? Ben, something's wrong with the lock. My key won't work." I heard Jake's car door slam as he got out to help, his voice carrying that artificial concern of someone who'd been caught in an uncomfortable situation. "Maybe you've got the wrong key, babe," he said, clearly wanting to distance himself from whatever domestic drama was about to unfold. Monica began pounding on the door with increasing desperation and volume. "Ben, open this door right now. I live here. This is my house too." I waited until she'd worked herself into a full drunken rage before opening the door, but only wide enough to pass through the divorce papers Mark had helped me prepare. Monica stared at the legal documents in confusion, her alcohol-clouded mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "What is this?" she slurred, swaying slightly as she tried to focus on the text. "Divorce papers citing adultery and abandonment," I said calmly. "Your belongings are in boxes in the garage. You're no longer welcome in this house." The words hit her like a physical blow, and suddenly she was more sober than she'd been all evening. "Ben, you can't be serious. We're getting married in 3 months. You're overreacting to a simple misunderstanding." Behind her, Jake shifted nervously from foot to foot, clearly regretting his decision to escort her home personally. This wasn't the discreet affair he'd signed up for. This was a legal confrontation that could damage his restaurant's reputation and his own carefully cultivated image. "There's no misunderstanding," I replied. "You texted me during my father's funeral to announce you were abandoning me for cocktails with your boyfriend. Then you spent the evening celebrating while I buried the only family I had left." Monica's composure cracked completely, and she began screaming about how I was being dramatic and unreasonable, how Jake was just a friend providing emotional support during a difficult time, how she'd never meant to hurt me and was just overwhelmed by grief. Her voice carried through the quiet suburban neighborhood, lights coming on in nearby houses as neighbors investigated the commotion. "You're making a scene," Jake said urgently, grabbing Monica's arm. "We should go. This is between you and your fiancé." But Monica was beyond rational thought, fueled by alcohol and the panic of watching her comfortable life disappear. "He's not my fiancé anymore, apparently. He's throwing away 3 years over one mistake." The irony of her calling months of cheating one mistake, while standing next to her lover, wasn't lost on me. Jake, however, had heard enough. As soon as the word divorce and the implications of being named in adultery proceedings became clear, his support evaporated instantly. "Monica, I think you should call your parents," he said, backing toward his BMW. "This is way more complicated than I thought. I can't be involved in this kind of drama." He was in his car and gone before Monica could respond, leaving her standing alone on the doorstep, divorce papers clutched in her shaking hands. She tried calling him repeatedly, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The man who'd encouraged her to leave her boring fiancé had abandoned her the moment their affair had real consequences. The divorce proceedings moved with surprising speed, largely because Monica's own family cut their financial support once they learned the full truth about her behavior at Walter's funeral. Her father, despite his wealth and usual willingness to solve his daughter's problems with money, was reportedly disgusted by the disrespect she'd shown during such a sacred family moment. Monica's mother, who'd always prided herself on proper social etiquette, was mortified that her daughter's actions had become neighborhood gossip and reflected poorly on their family's reputation. Without her parents' legal team and financial backing, Monica was forced to accept a settlement that left her with minimal assets and no claim to Walter's workshop or tools, which legally belonged to me as his sole heir. The jewelry box he'd crafted for her remained in my possession, a bittersweet reminder of his hopes for my future happiness. I threw myself into work with the same methodical dedication Walter had taught me, finding comfort in solving complex electrical problems and managing infrastructure projects that required long-term planning and attention to detail. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, while organizing Walter's remaining belongings, I discovered a sealed envelope tucked inside his toolbox with my name written in his careful handwriting. The letter inside was dated just 2 weeks before his death, as if he'd sensed his time was limited and wanted to leave me with final guidance. Son, it read, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to give you advice in person. I've been watching your relationship with Monica, and I'm worried you're trying so hard to make her happy that you've forgotten to notice whether she makes you happy in return. Real love isn't about expensive restaurants or impressing other people, it's about finding someone who values the same things you do, who respects your family and your values, who would rather spend quiet Saturday mornings with you than chase after something that looks more exciting. Don't settle for someone who sees you as a stepping stone to something better. Wait for someone who sees you as the destination. 6 months later, I was volunteering at the same veterans organization where Walter had spent so many years helping others, organizing an electrical safety workshop for families transitioning from military to civilian housing. That's where I met Elena Rodriguez, a structural engineer who'd been running similar workshops about home inspection and safety. She'd grown up in a military family, understood the importance of service and community, and shared Walter's philosophy about using professional skills to help others build better lives. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on shared values rather than physical attraction or social convenience. Elena appreciated the stories I shared about Walter's wisdom and craftsmanship, visiting his workshop with genuine interest and respect for the legacy he'd left behind. When I showed her the jewelry box he'd made for Monica, she understood immediately why I'd kept it, not as a shrine to the past, but as a reminder of the kind of thoughtful, lasting love Walter had wanted me to find. 8 months later, Elena and I had a simple wedding ceremony at the VFW hall where Walter's funeral had been held, surrounded by the same community of veterans and neighbors who'd supported me through my darkest time. As we exchanged vows in the same room where I'd learned the difference between people who show up when life gets difficult and those who abandon you when things become uncomfortable, I felt Walter's presence and approval surrounding us. Elena wore her grandmother's wedding dress instead of demanding something expensive and new, and the reception featured potluck dishes made by friends rather than catered luxury. It was exactly the kind of celebration Walter would have loved, genuine, humble, and focused on the commitment we were making to each other rather than impressing anyone with extravagance or status.